Welcome to Tales of History Uncovered.
Somewhere in the desert of southern Jordan, hidden behind a crack in the earth, barely wide enough for two camels to pass, lies a city that should not exist. No rivers run here, no forests, no farmland stretches to the horizon. And yet, 2,000 years ago, this impossible place became one of the richest cities on the planet. Then, without a single battle fought over it, without a single invading army marching through its gates, it vanished, not destroyed, not conquered, just forgotten. For centuries, the outside world had no idea it still existed at all. This is Petra, carved directly into rose-colored sandstone cliffs by a people history barely remembers. It was once the beating heart of a trade empire that connected Rome to India, Arabia to the Mediterranean. Its builders were called the Nabataeans, desert nomads who transformed sand and stone into one of the ancient world's most sophisticated cities. They mastered something no other civilization in this region had: water. In a land where a single rainstorm might come only once a year, they built a city that never went thirsty. Stand at the entrance of the Sikh, that narrow stone corridor twisting for over a kilometer between towering rock walls, and you are standing exactly where merchants, kings, and spies once stood, straining for their first glimpse of a city that seemed to grow directly out of the mountain itself. This is one of the driest, harshest landscapes on Earth. Summer temperatures climb well past body heat. Winter nights can drop near freezing. The rock offers little shade and even less mercy. And yet, the Nabataeans didn't stumble onto this location by accident. They chose it precisely because it was hostile, because it was hidden, because any army foolish enough to try to march through the narrow sec could be picked off from the cliffs above by a handful of defenders. The very geography that made Petra brutal to build also made it nearly impossible to conquer. The Nabataeans weren't building a city despite the desert. They were building a fortress because of it. Before they were builders, the Nabataeans were survivors. Long before the first tomb was carved, they lived as nomadic traders, moving herds and goods across the same unforgiving terrain, learning every hidden spring, every seasonal riverbed, every place the wind carried moisture instead of dust. That knowledge became their greatest weapon. While neighboring powers depended on fixed rivers and predictable farmland, the Nabataeans thrived precisely because they understood a landscape everyone else considered worthless. When they finally settled here permanently, they weren't gambling on the desert. They were cashing in on generations of hard-earned intimacy with it. Walk through Petra today and you'll notice something easy to miss but impossible to overstate: channels. Thin grooves cut into the rock, running for miles along cliff faces, guiding rainwater from distant hills down into the city. The Nabataeans built an intricate network of dams, cisterns, and ceramic pipes that could capture a single flash flood and store enough water to sustain tens of thousands of people through months of drought. Some of their reservoirs held millions of liters in a region where other civilizations collapsed from thirst. Petra threw parties. Gardens bloomed in the desert. Fountains ran in courtyards surrounded by nothing but rock and sun. To the merchants arriving after weeks crossing empty wilderness, walking into a city with flowing water must have felt less like a rival and more like a mirage that refused to disappear. What made this system remarkable wasn't just its scale, but its precision. Engineers calculated the exact slope needed to keep water moving without eroding the stone. They built settling tanks to filter out sediment before it reached the drinking supply. They positioned dams to redirect flash floods away from the city center entirely, protecting Petra from the very water that sustained it. A flood that could have drowned careless neighbors instead became, in Nabataean hands, a resource to be captured, filtered, and stored. Modern hydraulic engineers who study these systems today still find themselves impressed by decisions made without any of the tools we now consider essential. No computers, no modern surveying equipment, just centuries of trial, failure, and refinement, passed down through generations of desert life. Petra sat at the crossroads of everything: frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia, silk from lands so distant most Nabataeans would never see them, spices, ivory, and precious stones flowing from India through Arabian ports and up into the Mediterranean world. Every caravan that wanted to move goods between these worlds had to pass through Nabataean territory, and the Nabataeans made sure that passage came at a price. Taxes and tolls on trade routes turned this desert kingdom into one of the wealthiest societies of the ancient world, all without owning a single fertile field. At its peak, Petra may have held over 20,000 residents, an extraordinary number for a place with no natural water source and no farmland in sight. Wealth here wasn't stored in grain, it was stored in stone, in carved tombs, and in a skyline unlike anywhere else on the planet. A single frankincense caravan might stretch for kilometers, hundreds of camels loaded with resin harvested from trees 1,000 miles to the south, guarded against bandits, taxed at every checkpoint, and funneled directly through Petra's gates. The Nabataeans didn't just tolerate this traffic, they engineered their entire economy around it, building way stations, guarded rest stops, and secondary trading posts throughout the surrounding desert. By the time a shipment of incense reached Rome or Alexandria, its price had multiplied many times over, and much of that markup had passed directly through Nabataean hands. This wasn't luck. It was one of the ancient world's most sophisticated trade monopolies, run by a people most of their trading partners assumed were simple desert wanderers. The most breathtaking structures in Petra were never built upward. They were carved downward and inward, chiseled directly from solid rock faces, working from the top of a cliff down, rather than the ground up. There was no scaffolding to remove, no structure to assemble, just patient, brutal precision against stone, one hammer strike at a time. The most famous of these carvings, known today as the Treasury, rises nearly 40 meters, its columns and pediments looking as though Greek architects had simply materialized in the Arabian desert. In truth, it likely served as a royal tomb. Its ornate facade meant to awe anyone who wandered close enough. Nearby, an entire amphitheater was cut directly into the mountainside, capable of seating thousands. Somewhere between 300 and 800 tombs are carved into these cliffs, entire cemeteries hollowed straight from living rock, each one a monument to someone the city never wanted the desert to forget. Carving from the top down wasn't just a technical choice, it was a philosophy. Every mistake was permanent. There was no adding material back, no correcting a miscalculated angle once stone had been removed. A single misjudged strike could ruin months of work on a facade meant to honor a king or a god. And yet the results, even today, show almost no trace of hesitation. Complex geometric patterns, symmetrical columns, and delicately carved urns all emerged from rock using little more than iron chisels, wooden mallets, and an intimate understanding of how sandstone fractures and holds. These craftsmen weren't simply laborers. They were among the most skilled stoneworkers of the ancient world, and their work has now outlasted the empire that commissioned it by nearly 2,000 years. Beyond the monuments, Petra was, at its core, a living city. Streets bustled with merchants haggling in half a dozen languages. Camel caravans rested in shaded courtyards after weeks in open desert. Wealthy Nabataean families lived in homes decorated with imported goods from across the known world, while religious processions moved toward high mountain altars where sacrifices were made to gods tied to the desert and the stars. The Nabataeans absorbed influences from everywhere their trade routes touched, blending Greek architectural style, Egyptian religious symbolism, and their own nomadic traditions into something entirely unique. This was not a closed, isolated society. It was one of the most cosmopolitan cities of its era, built by people who understood that survival in the desert meant staying connected to everyone around it. High above the city center, accessible only by long stairways cut into the cliffs, sat the sacrificial high places, open-air altars exposed to wind and sky, where priests performed rituals tied to Dushara, the chief deity of the Nabataean pantheon, closely associated with the mountains themselves. Ordinary residents lived far more modest lives than the merchant elite, occupying smaller rock-cut dwellings and modest homes clustered near the city's edges, working as laborers, craftsmen, herders, and caravan hands who kept the entire trade economy functioning. Slaves and servants, often captured or purchased through the very trade networks that made Petra wealthy, performed much of the physical labor that built and maintained the city. Petra's grandeur rested on more than clever engineering. It rested on a strict and often unequal social order, much like every great civilization surrounding it. Petra's decline didn't come from war. It came from shifting currents far beyond its control. When the Roman Empire annexed the Nabataean kingdom in the 2nd century, Petra initially continued to flourish under Roman rule. But over time, sea trade routes began to replace overland caravans, pulling wealth away from desert cities entirely. Then, in the 4th century, a massive earthquake tore through the region, collapsing structures and severely damaging the city's delicate water systems, the very engineering that had allowed Petra to exist in the first place. Without reliable water, without its former trade dominance, the population dwindled. The city didn't fall in a single dramatic moment. It faded year after year, family after family, until only a small community remained among the ruins of what had once been an empire's capital. Even as its population shrank, Petra didn't vanish overnight in a physical sense. A modest Byzantine Christian community continued living among the ruins for centuries afterward, repurposing older Nabataean structures and even converting some carved tombs into churches. Archaeologists have uncovered mosaics and religious artifacts from this later period, evidence that life, in some diminished form, persisted here long after the city's golden age had ended. But this was a shadow of what Petra had once been. The grand trade routes were gone. The crowded marketplace was gone. What remained was a quiet, isolated settlement slowly being reclaimed by the same sand and stone that had once made it invincible. For centuries, Petra existed only in local memory, known to Bedouin communities living among its cliffs, but essentially erased from Western knowledge. European maps didn't include it. Historians debated whether it even still existed. Then, in 1812, a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, disguised as a Muslim traveler and fluent in Arabic, convinced local guides to lead him through the Essek under the pretense of wanting to make a sacrifice at a nearby tomb. What he found waiting on the other side stunned him into silence. An entire lost city, carved into rose-colored stone, sitting almost exactly as it had been left more than 1,000 years earlier. His account reintroduced Petra to the world, and travelers, archaeologists, and dreamers have been walking through that same narrow crack in the rock ever since. Burckhardt himself never got to fully explore what he'd found. Wary of revealing his true identity and purpose to his guides, he moved quickly through the site, taking careful mental notes rather than risking detailed sketches. It would be decades before serious archaeological work began, and even longer before Petra transformed from a remote curiosity into one of the most visited historical sites on Earth. Today, ongoing excavations continue to reveal new discoveries. Large portions of the city, particularly residential areas, away from the famous facades, remain unexcavated, buried beneath centuries of sand. Archaeologists estimate that what tourists see today may represent only a fraction of the full city still waiting beneath the surface. And yet, despite drought, earthquakes, shifting trade winds, and centuries of silence, Petra never truly disappeared. Its walls remained standing long after its people scattered. Its water channels still trace the cliffs, waiting for rain that occasionally still comes. Today, millions walk through the Seek each year, chasing the same first glimpse that stopped ancient merchants in their tracks. That impossible flash of carved stone rising out of nowhere. Empires rose and fell around Petra. Trade routes shifted. Entire civilizations vanished from memory. But a city carved into rock, it turns out, is remarkably hard to erase. History never truly disappears. Sometimes it just waits behind a narrow crack in the desert, patient enough to be found again. If you enjoyed this journey through the hidden city of Petra, subscribe for more cinematic adventures into the past, and tell us in the comments, which civilization should we explore next?